Good morning and welcome to our webcast on IT operation and what's new. My name is Henrik Sangenberg.
And I am Adrian.
And we will be taking you through 1.5 hours of breaking news and good old learnings on IT operation. So that aside, today's presentation is on IT operation and what's the latest news on that front. And let's move on. We have a tightly packed program, and I'm a little worried whether we'll get through. We won't get through all the slides, but I hope we'll get through all the issues, the subjects here. So we'll start out with a short introduction. Just setting the stage, what is ITO, how do we basically scope that service. Then we'll look into what's new in 2024, what do you need to pay special attention to in 2024. And then we'll dive into two subjects of great importance, right sizing and right pricing. And why it's important that you get them both right, and what you should do to ensure that. And then we'll go in breaking. We have breaking news on storage prices.
Yeah,
I think that's the cliffhanger we'll leave you with at this point. Adrian will take you through some of the new things we've observed in the market, and also go into application and database operation, a subject that we normally don't dwell that much into, so we'll spend a little time and give that subject some love today by explaining a little bit about what is it really that's driving the pricing in these two subcategories of IT operation. I will take you through some of the most important things to pay attention to when it comes to the service desk. And then we'll end up with also some breaking news on the pricing for cloud management in hybrid ITO agreements. So there's a lot of takeaways from today's presentation that you can take directly into to your next IT operation contract negotiation, or IT operation contract tender or RFP. So, Adrian, you are the benchmarking expert here at Sangenberg.
Yeah.
Responsible for the big model sitting on top of basically all these boxes.
Yeah.
Can you give us a 3.5 to 5 minutes walkthrough of this?
Well, I can give it a shot at least. So what you're looking at here is basically the IT stack with housing underneath. You have the network. You have mainframe, you have storage and server, basically all the compute-intensive, hardware-intensive services. You have application and database operations on top of that. Then there's, of course, the public cloud capacity. There's the cloud management and then the service desk and end-user computing components. That's the whole IT stack that we look at as part of the IT operations in a typical contract, basically. Of course, in a typical contract, you won't have all of these areas, but most of them you will probably see. For each of these components, basically, you have some parts of the ITO service. That's the hardware, the software, the FTEs or the staffing part, and then you have some other, basically. And for each of these areas, basically, you'll see that it varies which parts of the ITO services comprise most of the service. So for server and storage, it's a lot of hardware. For application and database operations, it's only FTEs, and so on. Basically, for all of these services, you also have some cost drivers here. So the more standardized your service is, the more typically it makes sense to do outsourcing. In a contract like this, when you're moving from an internal operations to outsourcing, you will have some transition and transformation typically. Increased complexity in the environment, that's also going to drive the costs. Then there is, of course, the scope, which is really important. So when you purchase your storage operations or your server operations? Is it including decommissioning and setting up servers, for example, or is that something you have to pay separately? That's something you need to be aware of. Then there's of course the SLAs. So what are the opening hours typically and the availability? It could also be, of course, for your service desk, how many tickets must be solved within a certain time and so on. So this also differs for each of the services, but SLAs is a big part of the cost, of course. And then there is the overall terms and conditions. So that's your location, for example. Is it supposed to be Danish resources? Can you nearshore? Is there no location demands? How much capacity flexibility do you have? Do you need design authority, and so on? So
penalty clauses.
Those
kind of things, yeah.
Yeah.
And those of you who've been to our presentations before have seen our multiplier. I don't think we have it in this presentation.
No.
But there's a lot of, and that goes, of course, for everything we talk about today, is that a lot of this is further described for those of you with a quarterly analytics subscription. There's a lot of articles there also covering all the terms and conditions that drives costs. We have a separate series on that, and those of you who don't have a quarterly analytics subscription, you can see that in some of our other webcasts that you'll find on our YouTube channel. So there's plenty of resources to dive into that. You mentioned the cloud component, and as you can see here in the stack, we have public cloud capacity as a separate bar. That's basically buying capacity from a hyperscaler. So that's one of the components. And then the more outsourcing related issue here is of course cloud management, where you basically ask your outsourcer to manage your public cloud capacity and your applications in the cloud. And we'll get back to that. But those are the newer components to the stack here.
Yeah, and since we're doing some teasers today, I can say that we have a slide that's already been made legendary, at least in our internal company, which is about cloud management, and we call it the ski hill, which you will see later.
Yep. Yeah. Stay tuned, all of you. Don't leave this presentation. So, main characteristics of the market we are looking at. It's a 20 billion Danish kroner market here in Denmark. The public sector is 1/3 of the total market, which is quite unusual. The market exhibits, for many years, it's exhibiting a 4% growth year over year. We're just about to sum up the numbers for last year, and as you can see, there will be a new market overview out in quarterly analytics in Q1 in 2024. We track 76 companies right now in this market, and they are divided into a number of segments. That is also something you can read a lot more about in quarterly analytics. So we won't go that much into that. Just noting that the upper half of the market is made out of 6 vendors. That used to be 4. So actually there's a little more competition for the bigger clients right now, and you have 6 bigger players, but you also have a very vibrant mid-market and a small niche and hosting market that is really where there's a lot of things going on, and you have a lot of players with their own, basically with typically very competitive pricing, but also with some issues for some of them. But read more in the market overview on that, because the major players have their issues as well. So there's a lot of things going on. It's an interesting market to work in, and it is important that you scope out your needs and try and match that to the characteristics of the players in the individual segments when we're shortlisting your vendors. So trends in the market, we won't spend a lot of time on that, but there's a lot of M&A activity. There's a lot of focus on cloud and FinOps. ESG is becoming more and more important. We'll have a separate webcast on the ESG later this spring, so we won't go that much into ESG today. Environmental, social, and governance, so that's basically carbon emission, footprint, benchmarking, and stuff like that, and we'll cover that in a webcast soon. Hybrid cloud is becoming the standard, so that is basically contracts with both classical outsourcing on-prem on the vendor's premises and cloud components. But these cloud offerings are still under development. They are not as mature as you will see with the more traditional ITO services. Okay, and I can see there's been a little mishap here in the translation. So security services on the rise, and agile development programs are basically putting new demands on ITO services. So there's a few slides that we believe is the main takeaways from today's presentation, and this is one of them. This is why it's so boring. It's to say it's important, therefore it's boring. So we don't need to sex it up because it's interesting in its own. No, it is basically, these are the points we want you to take away. Now more than ever, it is important to understand how you believe your needs will change over the next 6 years. Now, when you entered into an outsourcing agreement 15 or 20 years ago, you were looking into something that would be probably relatively stable, at least more stable than you should expect the future to be during the next 6 years. So you need to have some kind of understanding of what you will most probably be needing over the next 6 years. And we'll give you some hints and tools to basically try and focus on that. You need to decide whether cloud management is in or out. You need to make sure that you have price adjustments. We'll get back to that. You need to understand that storage pricing is changing, and you need to take that into account if you're going to renew, if you're going to extend your existing contract, or if you're going to make a new contract. You need to understand the dynamics, the new dynamics of storage pricing that Adrian will take you through. The same is true for service desk. There's a lot of things going on in that market. You need to utilize the newest developments in order to get the right price, but also in order to modernize the way you basically look at this area. And then, of course, security services now and potential needs in the future. It's important that you understand what the market can offer and where you should put your focus. And we will basically give you some insights to that. So that this should be your checklist for your next agreement. Make sure that you have all these bases covered in your next agreement. Yeah. There's a typical set of schedules. This is just one example. I won't delve into that. I'll just move on to basically one of the issues here, and that's security. There are two main areas, and then there's a lot of details. But basically, there are two main areas that we see a lot of our clients struggle with, and that you need to basically settle in your next agreement. One is basically the SOC, the Security Operations Center. Is that part of what you're outsourcing, or do you have your own, or is it with another outsourcer? So those of you with a multi-sourcing environment, you need to decide where to put your SOC. And if you put it with one vendor, you need to make sure that the integration and the tooling and so on works across your landscape. But if you're settling with a SOC in your next agreement, make sure that you have the slash, the organization set up, and the volumes that you have them right. So there's volume, there's the gigabyte of logs, but there's also the number of events that's driving the pricing here. The tooling part is basically is on what we call SIEM, Security Incident and Event Management. Here you need to decide on tooling, you need to decide on the architecture, and you need to have your integrations under control. All the applications you need to, your security operations center to basically have surveillance and event management on needs to be integrated. This is not a small task. So make sure that you have at least an architecture in place and a plan for building these integrations over time, and make sure that is funneled into your negotiation on a security operations center, that it's basically part of the pricing of that. There's a number of other security services, and you can find them all described in a quarterly analytics article. And those of you not with no access, send us a mail, and we'll send you some more details on this. But these are basically the typical security services you could expect your vendor to be able to provide. So one thing is, take the list and ask yourself, is it likely that we will have a need for any of these services over the next 6 years? Do we have a need for them now? If you either need them over the course of the next 6 years, or you basically need them now, you should put them into your contract. You should have them priced and described in your current contract. I won't go into the details here, but these are important services, and they're becoming increasingly important in the market. Okay, so we promised you something on right sizing and right pricing, and this is your cue, Adrian.
Well, thank you, Henrik.
You're welcome.
Well, we already basically touched upon this in the first slide, right, when we talked about the cost drivers in IT. It's the hardware, and of course there is the power for this hardware. There's the salaries of the FTEs or the staffing, and then there's the software. We already touched basically on these cost drivers. Historically, when we looked at these, there's been a decreasing costs, basically because there is some technological development in the hardware, so the price per unit of capacity has been decreasing. You've had increased energy efficiency, so you need less power. So the power consumption per unit of capacity is decreasing, and then basically with the increased automation, each person is becoming more efficient, being able to complete more tasks. And then we had the whole consolidation and standardization of IT operations with the merging of data centers and sharing administrative resources and so on, providing increased access to economies of scale. All of this has had a downward impact on the costs. If we move on, basically...
Yeah, perhaps one thing, I don't know, but one thing is, this has been a pretty constant for the last 50 years, more or less, that these have all been moving downwards, perhaps with the exception of software, but we've seen a downward pricing development, cost development here.
Yeah, but when we look at basically the last few years, there's been a lot of uncertainty in the market. There's been the energy crisis, the war in Ukraine, there's the chip shortage, the whole inflation and the high need for resources has been difficult to find, and basically now we're also seeing just immense uncertainty around software prices, with it's really taking an impact now.
We just had a webcast on the skyrocketing software last week, and it's on the YouTube channel. So those of you who are interested in diving into that area, go to YouTube and find that webcast. But basically the conclusion there is software prices are going up at a very fast rate right now. We are seeing basically that the software vendors are weaponizing their negotiation tactics in this area. So expect also that to have some impact.
Yeah, and on the IT operations part, there you could say the purchase of VMware from Broadcom is leading to some uncertainty whether or not they're going to use some of the same tactics that they used around mainframe software, for example. So that's something that we are really looking into, because basically VMware has all of the virtualization markets. They have a really large market cap.
We had a wonderful picture of the CEO of Broadcom together with Donald Trump. His good friend. So there's probably a lot of good things in the future coming from that front. So
Yes, but still, when we look at our picture, we've been tracking the market prices for IT infrastructure. The prices have consistently been falling, and this is updated with the newest numbers in the Q3 2023, and we still see basically that the prices have been falling. We haven't seen that the prices have been going up.
So I think that's the one single question we get the most. Is when do you expect the prices to go up? And the answer to that is well, we don't expect them to go up. We expect the decline to be smaller, and that's also what we are seeing. But we don't expect any price increases anytime soon. And there's a lot of reasons for that. But basically Moore's law, the underlying higher capacity for the same, the higher hardware capacity for the same dollar every 1 year or every 18 months or whatever it is still in place. So Moore's law is still drawing the prices down, even though you have all the factors we showed before that to some extent have an upwards impact on the vendor's cost. Moore's law is still extremely powerful in driving the total cost picture down. And this is
basically it's the same picture, but when you look at the server and storage index, which make up the majority of the Sangha index, as it's usually takes up most of the ITO contract, the prices have been continue to fall in Q3, but not as quickly as before. But still, when you look at the last 3 years that you can see the bottom right in the graph, it's still 6%, 4.8, 2.6. So for server, it's still about 13% in the last 3 years, and you have similar numbers for storage or even higher, which means that with the common ITO contract being 4 years, you still have quite a big development in the unit prices when you look at a 3 or 4 year period.
Another question could of course be looking at these quite small reductions over the last year. What do we expect to see the prices continue to fall with that percentage over the coming years? It's difficult to answer that question, but I would bet at least some of my money on that we'll see a larger decrease in the years to come as the effect of all the crisis will more or less settle, and new technological developments will have an impact, and also the fact that, and we'll get back to that later, but the fact that most of you will consume immensely more of both CPU and storage in the future. So the volume in the market will increase substantially, which will drive, at least in itself, to some extent, the prices down. So what we saw in 2023, which is basically a very modest reduction in the prices, we expect that to basically be bigger in the future. But do we expect to get back to the good old days in 2014 and 2015 with 11 or even 20, I think it's 23% decline in prices? No, probably not, but less can do, we believe. And also this of course speaks into the main point that we make. It is important to right price your contract. So even if you entered into a contract in 2020 or 2019, there's still a substantial potential in basically just getting the prices to current market level. That's still worth the effort, which is also a conclusion from this slide. And then we just dived into it and said the Sangberg index and the server and storage index. For those of you new to us, we've done this since 2010, and we have published these indices since 2013. And the numbers for the indices comes out of our benchmarking model, which is basically calibrated with all the data that we see in the market during our benchmarking exercises. So this is based on a substantial number of contracts in the market. Yeah.
Yes, and basically what you said is that one thing is getting the prices right, but we're also going to talk about basically the quantities, and that's where right sizing comes into the picture. So basically this scenario right here is from a contract that we benchmarked in 2022, and we looked at the assets infrastructure cost, and then it was a contract that was I believe about 4 or 5 years old at the time. When we benchmarked that, we found basically a savings potential of 2.7 million. But after that, we also looked into basically the right sizing potential, and typically we find that the potential is about 20 to 30% by adjusting the CPU, memory, and disk space just in the existing environment. And most of that, or a lot of that, comes from basically the significant license savings from core-based software licenses. So that could be database licenses or reductions in the virtualization licenses or the OS licenses. And much of that is typically from the low-hanging fruit, which is from the servers with the low utilization. So basically the blue, the dark blue showed what happened when we benchmarked, and then the next three is just an example of scenarios where the end state, where you have right-sized the server capacity, you have taken all the low-hanging fruit, you have reallocated storage within the current tier, so you have assessed whether the tiering was correct. Do we need to have our storage on SSDs or some of that colder? Well, all of this potential is typically there. It's about 20 to 30%, but it also depends on how much time the client invests. So of course the low-hanging fruit is something that you can go and grab pretty easily. But if you want to do a full right-sizing exercise, then it does take some time investment.
Yeah, you could say that getting from 14.3 to 11.6, that's basically a negotiation. That's a benchmarking and a negotiation and contract revision exercise. So that is pretty easy, you could say. So that's basically called Sangberg. We'll tell you where the new point is. Go negotiate it, sign a new contract, easy peasy. The next part is, of course, it takes a little more effort, but it's equally important. Because there's usually a lot of money to be saved there as well in the right sizing. And here you can do several things. You can ask external advisors to help you find these potential. You can ask your vendor. You can make that part of the RFP if you're putting your contract up for tender. Is to basically ask the vendors bidding for the contract whether they can find any optimization handles, because those that will find the most will most likely win. So that's also an idea. But it is important, and right sizing is important. And it is important because what will happen is that you will need even more capacity in the future. So if you do not utilize your current capacity and just put more capacity on top, there's a chance that you will basically copy that behavior and have more still have underutilization in what you are adding. So it's also a matter of getting that culture right in right sizing. Yeah, we've talked a lot about how you should control your IT finances. And basically, and we'll have a webcast 2 weeks from now with the PwC, where we're talking about IT financial management in broader terms, but it all comes back to this. If you are looking into the future, you need to understand that the cost of your IT is a P times Q equation. It's basically a unit price, getting that right, the P, and it's a Q, it's a quantity thing, and that's the right sizing part of it. But you need to understand what will happen in the future, and that's basically translating the activity that will take place in the business, new AI initiatives, more cameras in your production environment, more analytics, more data storage, and so on. All the activities that goes on in your business, you need to translate that into the future capacity need, and you need to transform your capacity need into a cost picture. So the most important thing is your capacity prognosis, which is basically in the middle circle here, to get that deeper understanding of where you're moving and what your contract should be able to encompass. And our point is, because we've worked with a number of our clients on this, is the future is going to be expensive because your capacity, if you are just in a mainstream kind of client, then your capacity needs will double over the next 3 years. And this is driven by a number of megatrends that we could talk about in great length. But basically, it will be driven by what your business units will be doing in the future, how they will utilize technology, especially AI and related technologies that will require a lot more capacity.
Basically, this is just another example. This is a client that we looked at for each year for 10 years. I think the biggest takeaway here is that that there's been a huge annual growth, but also that just looking at the absolute numbers, even when you have 20 petabyte, going from 20 to 30 is still happens in 1 year. So even if you get to a really big environment, it almost even just goes faster at that point.
We have a lot of clients with petabytes of storage, and this is obviously one of them. And just, I mean, from 20 to 30 petabyte in 1 year, that is a huge increase.
Yeah.
Driven by a number of factors within this specific client. And we tried to sum it up in a number of themes, megatrend themes that we believe is going to, we and all other futurists basically believe will be changing the way you use IT. AI and the increased digitization of even more processes and areas in your organization, but very much driven by AI. Your increased obsession with data and analytics to basically make sense out of the data, increased security requirements, the way that you will now be building applications out of past components in a more composable way, And then also sustainability. Sustainability will not have that big an impact on your capacity usage, but it will have an impact on your software usage, and also on your development, your governance, and in the business. So let's not move too much into this, but just saying that you will be recording massive amounts of new data, and the list on the left is a good list to take to your business areas and ask, will you be doing any of this? Because if you will be doing anything to do with surveilling cameras, streaming cameras in production, satellite images, drones, 3D scanners, recording Teams meeting, anything to do with videos, complex graphics, but also sensors on the right, IoT, the Internet of Things. All of that also will basically result in a massive load of new data in your organization that you will need to store. These are just some examples. If you go to basically a webcast where you can calculate the storage use of having 30 cameras running in 30 days, recording everything in either MJPEG or H.264, and saving it on a standard SAN. That could take up, that alone, those 30 cameras alone, with a 30-day rolling window, could take out up either 20 terabytes or 431 terabytes, depending on all the settings that you can select, including the video quality, the resolution, and so on. So looking at the pricing, if you put up 30 cameras and just save the recordings in 30 days, but you record and store in the highest format, it will set you back 1.6 million Danish kroner a year. Which is, of course, that's a substantial addition to what you're doing today. Yeah, just a second. We need. A breaker.
Yes. And of course, we've already talked a lot about storage, and that's why we're going to do basically a deep dive here, also with some of the latest news. But basically, to understand this a little bit further, we want to do a throwback basically to a quarterly analytics article that we wrote about a year ago. And basically, this graph shows that you have the linear straight line going up. Basically, that's the total price for outsourced storage operations, where you typically purchase storage with a linear fixed unit price that doesn't really change depending on the capacity. So if you purchase 1 terabyte or 1 petabyte, the price is the same.
The price per gigabyte is basically the same.
Yeah. But if you look and compare that with basically the hardware costs that you'd have if you had internal operations, of course you'd purchase storage in some chunks, then you add some capacity, you use that, and when you reach about 80% of the used capacity, then you'd upgrade and get this basically this staircase. At the same time, you have, of course, there's some people that you need to run this storage. What we find there is that, of course, you need some people at first, but when the storage environment gets big enough, when you add more hardware, you don't really need more people.
Yeah, this is a dynamics that we basically observed within those of our clients who have their own data center, and benchmarking those data centers, especially large shared service centers, we could basically see that at some point they didn't really need any more people. And when comparing data centers with each other, we could find that we saw that, basically at a certain point, it flatlines. The only thing that could really mean that you would need more people would be that if you're changing technology and working with more technology together, and then you perhaps would need some more people working with that new technology. But basically, this has been the dynamics in internal staffing, and that also meant that at a certain point there was at a certain point for all internal organizations, it would be extremely expensive to outsource. Because obviously if you are at the point of the graph where we're sitting, right below, if that's where you are, and there's a number of shared service centers in Denmark that actually works here, then buying from an outsourcer would increase the total price, the total cost extensively. So that was a dynamic that we've seen for a number of years.
Yeah, and that's basically what this shows. So we marked the point where if you add the staffing cost and the hardware costs, where does it go from being more expensive or cheaper or more expensive than the outsourcing prices? So all the parts from the straight line and to the left, the outsourcing price is cheaper than the internal costs. But when you reach a certain amount of storage, basically the outsourcing price becomes more expensive than internal costs. So at really high volumes of storage, we've seen that there's basically no organization out there that has a really large environment that has been doing outsourcing their storage, because it's just not cost effective at all. Yes, and basically what we're starting to see is that suppliers are offering volume discounts for large storage quantities. And basically what this describes that at a certain point here, there's offered a volume discount. So that means you get basically this line that suddenly is growing at a lower rate beyond a certain level. Of course, the big question here has also been, for us at least, at which point basically does it make sense to outsource your storage or make sense to insource your storage, or basically at what level of storage capacity do you begin to observe these volume discounts? And basically previously we've seen that the amount of storage that you had to commit to get any real discount was really big. So we've seen, for example, in 2016 a contract where you had to purchase or commit to 5 petabyte of storage before you'd see any discounts. And basically that has been decreasing. The required minimum commitment has been decreasing. And now in basically that's why we're going full breaking news, is that during the last quarter we saw that at prices of at commitments as low as 75 terabyte, you actually got quite a big discount on the storage. And then at 150 terabyte, you got an even bigger one. And that was a much lower minimum commitment that we'd usually see. So we usually saw that you had to commit to at least 1 petabyte or something like that.
Which was also, I guess you can say we were a bit surprised by the numbers that we are showing you right now, because we think that that's actually a pretty low threshold.
Yeah.
Because if you and these are observed prices in the market, but whether that's going to stick at those levels, nobody knows. But that's at least what we observe right now. But the interesting thing is that if the vendors took a more what you could call alternative option picture to this, saying, okay, when does it make sense for a client to, basically going back to this one, where's the line, the vertical line here, where does it, because the vertical line is where it does not, under the old pricing regime, where it does not make sense to outsource, because it will become more expensive to outsource than it will be to have it insourced. And our calculation with most clients has been that, that line is somewhere around 1 petabyte, give or take. But as you can see right now, the market seems to be settling now on a at least for the massive discount for 150 terabytes. So this is the breaking news, and this is something that you should take into your next negotiation. Is basically to ask for volume discounts if you are at least if you are above 75 terabyte, and especially if you're above 150 terabyte.
Yeah, and if you are looking at a contract that has to be work for the next 4 years, then maybe think this into the future price model. So think about the growth that you're expecting in the storage environment.
We are back, and moving to the next topic. We have a lot of ground to cover, so there's no rest for the wicked. This is an area that we've basically, this area is an area that we haven't given that much love in our presentation and webcast. So let's do that today.
Yeah, well, basically we're going to talk a little bit about application and database operations, which we typically only look at with regards to the work required, so not any of the underlying hardware and software, just to make that clear.
Because the service only consists of, there might be a little software, but it for all practical terms, it is only an FTE-based service.
Yeah, and when we look at the application and database operations, of course, we try to figure out how many people do we need to run the applications and databases that we have. Some of the common issues that we look at with regards to this area is basically the scope distinction between application operations, application maintenance, and application development. We also look at basically, it's the one that we have here, and it's a really important distinction that we need to make clear. So when we talk about operations, we talk about activities within monitoring and reporting, backup and recovery performance, capacity management, administration, and patch management. That's the operational scope. That when we benchmark basic application operations, we look at how many applications do we have to run, and what's the complexity of the applications. When we look at application maintenance, that's a whole different area where we look at how many tickets do you have to solve, how many changes and so on do we have. And then there's of course development of new functionality. That's again a whole different area where we look at basically mostly projects, or you need basically purchase this as hours and for each FTEs and so on.
And I think an important point here is that we see a lot of contracts where you have application operation and application maintenance in a single contract, and the lines tend to be a little blurred between the two. That's a very, very bad idea, because that basically makes it possible for the vendor to conceal costs in the entire contract setup. You need to make sure that your contract has really double walls between the operation part and the maintenance part, because the operations part should be benchmarkable, should follow market prices and so on. It's a much more standardized service, and one that you need to be able to handle on its own. And then maintenance is another beast, and we have separate webcasts on maintenance. Can be benchmarked, should follow its own dynamics of decreased volume of tickets and so on, but it's another type of contract.
Yeah, and then another important thing when basically assessing the amount of people that you need for the applications is what is the complexity of the application landscape. And what we see there is that most suppliers use a three-tier model, and we have basically also written our own descriptions of these. So for example, a standard application is defined by some or all of the following things, such as based on the standard software as one server, doesn't have any interfaces or time scheduled jobs, there's no redundancy, and the number of users is about 1 to 50. When we look at the next definition, so the special application or the complex application, then all of these parts will differ. And the thing that is usually or can be a problem here is that there is some part of subjective assessment in this. So when you do it like this, the method does not have basically the highest precision, but it's feasible to apply to even a large application portfolio. And the most common proxy that you use to score if you have 1,000 applications that you need to look at is basically how many servers do you have for each application, because that's some data that you can quite quickly usually gather and use as a pretty good estimate for this.
And again, the more applications you have, the less precision you really need for the individual application. It's typically quite easy to identify all the standard applications.
Yeah.
You can do that based on the name of the application, whether it's to see whether it's a standard, it's a piece of standard software running on a single server. So those, which often takes up quite a big volume of the total number of applications, can be extracted. And then it is as you say, then it becomes a matter of a more subjective categorization, or according to these parameters. And you usually will get quite close to where the vendors would be in this by doing that. And it's a good piece of work to do before you enter into an outsourcing agreement, or when you are extending your agreement, is to have this categorization in place, because it has a huge impact on the price, whether the application is a standard, a special, or a complex. So without disclosing the numbers in our database, if you were to say anything about the ratio between the standard, the special, and the complex?
Well, usually you have between a standard and a special, it's about, if a standard is index 100, then a special would be around 150, and a complex application would be maybe around 300. So there's 3 times difference basically between a standard and a complex application.
So it does make, it does make sense to get this at least somewhat right.
Yeah, and it's a good idea to see how it's defined in your contract, because basically this application complexity categorization can be quite different between contracts. So in this example here, the case A, basically what you see is that it follows quite good our definitions, applications for the simple, standard, and complex. It looks at the integrations, the servers, the users, and the application releases, and so on. But in the other case, it's maybe more difficult to see how it's defined, and it's not as quantitative exactly how it's defined. So we'll have more subjective assessment to that. So a good idea is to check how your contract defines this. Look at how many applications fall into each of the categories, and maybe also compare it. If it's the supplier that's done the categorizations, maybe look at the application list and think, okay, we have this many complex applications. Does that really always make sense? But that's something you can dive into. And if you have one application, for example, that you need to have a higher degree of accuracy in the categorization, well, then we have a detailed model on how to do that. Basically, we look at the application, we look at how many underlying servers is there, how many databases are connected, and which type of database, because it's not the same if it's Microsoft SQL or Oracle, or if you have both type of databases, then, well, increases the complexity. You also want to look at how many meetings are needed for the application per year, how many changes, how many releases, and so on. And we have this basically quite specific model where you can enter all of these counts for a lot of different volume drivers, and then you have some hours associated with each of the activities. And basically you get a quite accurate view of what is the total amount of hours that will be related to the operating of this application.
So for you, those of you where application operation takes up a more substantial amount, give us a call and we can discuss with you the final details of this to get this right.
Yeah. Now, the other thing that we're going to talk a little bit about is the pragmatic metric of database operations. So we're just moving on from applications here. It differs quite a lot, basically, how database operations are priced in the contract. So if you just take the picture here, you'll see that on a typical database server, you will have one or more database instances. And on each instance, you might have one or several databases. And what we see in some contracts is that it's priced per database. But that actually suggests that each individual database undergoes separate backup, recovery, tuning, and other processes, and thereby adds to the overall workload. But that's actually typically not the case, and that's why we believe there is a better metric for pricing database operations. So if you move on to the next slide, basically the cost of database operations primarily depends on the count of database instances to be serviced. That's because you can do a lot of the work at the instance level, and then it will move on to the database level. So the required staffing depends on the instance count, not the database itself. That's just quite important to be aware of, and look at your contract and see how are the databases priced in our contract.
And as you move into the future of substantially more databases, because you're moving into a future of substantially more data from more sources, this becomes increasingly more important. That pricing at the database level will set you off in a wrong direction, because the real complexity does not come from whether you have a database per camera or per camera setup, but whether you have an instance, a database instance that basically covers all the cameras that you have, to have that as an example. Or if you have one instance that is covering a data warehouse and so on. So make sure that you work at the instance level.
Yeah, and that's just the summary here is that ensure that your contract clearly defines the scope of operations. So what's the distinction between operations, maintenance, and development? Then check how your contract defines the application complexity, and check whether it's been applied correctly, and you can of course ask for help with that. And ensure that your database operation is priced based on instances and not the databases themselves.
Okay, I will take you through the service desk very quickly. We have a separate webcast on service desk that's about a year old, but still very much relevant. But basically, what's going on with the service desk is that you see a lot of technological development within the operation of service desk that basically reduces the ticket price substantially, but also automates a number of tickets and make them go away because of self-service or shift left, as it's often called, where you basically move activities out of the service desk into the user domain, either by users servicing themselves through self-service portals or something like that, or by using bots, chatbots, to find out how to solve things, or using knowledge management repositories to find the solution to their problems. when you are outsourcing your service desk, there's a number of focus areas that you need to look into in terms of understanding the cost, the amount of tickets, how the tickets are distributed. That's extremely important, and we'll get to that. The terms and conditions and so on. So there's a number of cost drivers that you need to understand. And the deep dive is basically to understand what kind of tickets do you have in your service desk. So you basically need to categorize your tickets in order to understand what's going on and what is driving cost. And there's a lot of these activities in the service desk that you can do stuff about. User administration is a typical area where you can have self-service or even make the tickets go away in some kind, where you have other areas that will require a service desk. For example, questions to business applications and stuff like that. So categorization of service desk tickets, that's something we do and help clients with, utilizing machine learning algorithms to make sense of the text that was put into the service desk tickets, can identify different areas, different categories of tickets that you could do something about. For example, the password reset, you have 34,000 password reset calls to the service desk every year. And that's of course something that you could have. You could put a self-service portal in place and make those tickets go away. So those are areas for optimization. That's extremely important that you do this kind of categorization, and you do it before you enter into the agreement with into the negotiation with the vendor on your new service desk contract. So categorization of your tickets is perhaps the most important piece of work you need to do in order to understand what you are outsourcing. The other thing is to have, and this is a bit messy, this slide, but it is about knowledge management. You should expect your vendor to have mature knowledge-centered services in place, which means that they should have processes in place to ensure that whenever they've solved a new problem, that will reoccur with some level of certainty. Then they will write down articles for the service agents to be able to find the resolution to that problem second, third, and fourth time around. And that is an area where most of the mature, and especially the Indian players in the market, where they've invested hugely in setting up knowledge management practices. And this will have an impact on the price and the expected the expected price per ticket in the future. So investigate whether this is in place, and if you have your own large-scale service desk, look into knowledge management. But it's an area where you need to make sure that this is in place with the vendor you contract with, because this will have an impact on the price. Okay, so last point here today. We have 13 minutes. I think we'll get through it with without doing it too fast. The last is on what Tyre, and I hope you're still out there, Tyre, that you managed to get through all the other points, because now we're getting to your question on the cloud part. Basically what we're seeing is there's a number of mega trends in place here. Most organizations will end up in a hybrid setup with some classical outsourcing, perhaps even some on-prem, on their own premises, and then a number of applications running in the cloud. either pure yes or a combination of yes and PaaS, which is where most of our clients are moving right now. So that's the future. You will end up in your problem most probably is in some kind of a hybrid setup, and it will become the cloud part of it will become more significant over time. There's if you have your on-prem on your own premises, then moving to the cloud will actually add to your what we call the marginal cost of on-premise. So the smaller your own footprint becomes, the larger the price per server, per gigabyte, and so on, which will lead to many clients actually at some point in time that they want to move the remaining part of their on-prem to an outsourcer. There's a lot about how much volume you will get into the cloud. I think I have one here saying that a lot of our clients, they have the hope that they can rehost a lot of applications, but the reality is that they will actually have to either re-platform, refactor, or reinvent new serverless microservices, basically rewrite their applications. So the reality compared to the hope of many organizations is that moving to the cloud is becoming much more difficult than they thought it would be, more expensive, and the result is some of the workload will never be moved to the cloud. That is what's going on right now, which leaves us in a highly hybrid environment. So FinOps is becoming an important discipline, so making sure that you understand the financials and optimize your cloud consumption. And the organization needs to keep up with the use of the cloud in terms of understanding the cloud management and the cloud management services. And this is where we get to today's topic. So should you have cloud management services as part of your contract? And we believe that most clients will end up in either asking their vendor to take care of some or all of the cloud management, or at least have that as an option in the contract. And if you believe that this is likely to happen in the future, why not put it in the contract as an option? Why not price the cloud management services in the contract now rather than later? Probably your negotiation position right now is pretty favorable when you are renegotiating a big contract, or if you're putting a big contract up for RFP, it's even more favorable. So why not have the cloud management services as part of the contract? We believe you should, and we've developed a number of standard service descriptions. We'll get back to that shortly for the cloud management services, and there's no secret or protected IP in that, so we can make that available to you. But these services are getting more and more standardized in the market. They're not fully standardized, but they're getting more standardized. And by that, we also begin to see prices that we can compare and build into our benchmarking model. And this is breaking news again. So we will now share with you some of the insights on the pricing, and we find it quite interesting. And this is the ski slope, or the ski hill, or whatever you call it, on the pricing of cloud management. Often we see that cloud management is tied to the primary resources, and in a IaaS cloud management setup, that is typically the VMs. There are contracts where you have a combination of IaaS and PaaS services. It becomes a little more complicated there if you have a lot of databases or even app services or container services or stuff like that. It becomes a little more complicated because then you need to agree on what is what's the unit of measure. But if in a IaaS contract, it's typically the VM. And the interesting part here is that you will find that if you buy a few cloud management for a few VMs, it's quite expensive. You'll pay, as you can see here in the area, 750 Danish kroner a month per VM. Now, bear in mind that the VM itself, or the alternative, the outsourced server, would be basically in the same range. So cloud management is quite expensive for a small number of VMs, and the small number here is 350. When you go beyond 350, it seems right now in this pretty immature market, so all the disclaimers taken here, but it seems like at 350, most vendors tend to agree that then the price per VM declines, and to the point about 1,450 VMs, where it basically stabilizes at the lowest price of 145 Danish kroner per VM. Substantially lower. Will this change? Most likely, which is why you need to stay in close contact with Sangenberg all the time, all the way, because we are monitoring this. But this is what the market looks like right now. And there's a lot of conclusions to take away from this. And there's also a bit of explanation. Why is this, as we explain here? Well, does it make sense to pay 750 per VM for cloud management? Well, that depends, because if you look at the alternative, the VM board, as if you take the phone and call one of the vendors we talked about in the beginning of the presentation, you can buy a VM, a small VM, in a classical outsourced scenario. You can buy that for somewhere between, I don't know, 600 and
600 and 800.
600 and 800 Danish kroner. Here you pay 750 for the management of the resource within a hyperscaler, and you even have to pay the hyperscaler on top of that. So it will be per VM will become much more expensive. But this is the pricing here. I'm sorry, we were just interrupted shortly. But the pricing here is does it make sense? Yeah, it makes sense if you look at the alternative for a client running, say, 100 servers in Azure. That client will have to have people managing those VMs as well. And if you look at the cost that client will have for managing 100 VMs in the cloud, the number of FTEs to do that, the number of FTEs for making sure you have these people educated, up to date, have the right tooling and so on, well, it actually kind of does make sense, because the alternative cost of doing it yourself makes this quite an attractive value proposition. What it points to is that having 100 VMs in the cloud in itself is a bad idea, unless there are some really, really good business reasons for that, because that is an expensive way to buy capacity, no matter whether you do it yourself or you have someone do it. So this actually it kind of points to another problem, the problem of having a small cloud footprint. Go big or go home, don't do it at all, is basically what this also says. And it is, we believe it's extremely interesting that the market is actually moving in this direction. Whether some vendors will find a way to deliver a smaller amount of VMs at a lower unit price by industrializing this delivery is very interesting. But there is a lot of governance for the individual client. So having one client with 100 VMs has a starting point in terms of cost for the vendor. So building your new contract with cloud management means that you need to have a pricing model in place. Do not accept the 750 Danish kroner per VM as the pricing model for all the VMs. You need to build in some kind of ski slope into your pricing agreement. That is really the point here. So make sure that you understand that this is the dynamics of the market right now. If you're building a contract that looks 6 years ahead, make sure that it has this kind of structure built into it. That's point number one. Point number two, you need to make sure you basically understand whether you have this as part of your existing contract scenario on the left, or whether you have a separate contract for cloud management and public cloud capacity, which is always a consideration. And then there's the definition of the services. We've built a model that we've used with a number of clients that has service description, and on the right you see just a fraction of that service description. On the left you see the different categories that this service description contains. And it right now we have 90 different requirement areas in that service description. So it's quite a substantial piece of documentation that you need in your contract to make sure that you have cloud management described to the right level of detail. So make sure that is in place in your contract. So with that, and hope to see you soon on a webcast. Bye bye.